From the Atlantic to the Pacific, Canada is crisscrossed by a network of railroads. Carved from the wilderness in the days of steam and horsepower, these steel highways helped forge a nation and remain some of the last tangible links between modern Canada and its historic genesis. Each stretch of railway has its own story to tell, and some stories are stranger than others. In this video, we will explore tales of phantom trains, ghostly brakemen, and other Canadian railroad mysteries. Enjoy!
Before we proceed, I'd like to tell you about the horrific true story of Marcus C., a Texan man whose identity was stolen from him when he was a teenager. The thief was a career criminal who spent 20 years committing all sorts of heinous crimes under Marcus's name. Due to astonishing flaws in the American justice system, Marcus spent the best years of his life struggling to clear his name of humiliating felonies he'd never committed. The identity theft ultimately cost him his marriage, his children, his house, and any prospect of a stable career. The worst part of the story is that Marcus is not alone. According to a study conducted by America's Federal Trade Commission, about 9 million Americans have their identities stolen from them every year. These thefts are often made online and are nearly always committed by habitual criminals, cemented to their lifestyle by some addiction. Victims of identity theft, unfortunately, often do not have an easy way out of their predicament, and, as if their horrific financial losses aren't bad enough, many of them are obliged to go to court. Some, through no fault of their own, have even spent time in jail. The prospect of this nightmare is why I'm very pleased to tell you about this video's sponsor, Aura. In addition to offering identity theft insurance, Aura finds data brokers who expose your personal information online and forces them to take down that information. When you subscribe to Aura, you're also given access to other valuable online data protection services, including antivirus, parental controls, password management, and a VPN. You get everything at one affordable price. Let Aura do the hard work of keeping you safe online, so you can focus on your life with peace of mind. Go to my sponsor, https://aura.com/Hammerson to get a 14-day free trial and see if your personal information has been leaked online. Please keep in mind that by signing up for a free trial using my link, you help my channel directly. Thanks for considering, and thank you Aura for sponsoring this video. When someone tells a ghost story, there is usually an implication that the spectral subject or subjects of the tale constitute spirits of the dead, perhaps trapped in limbo between our world and the great beyond, perhaps unable to move on due to some unusually powerful ties to or unresolved business on Earth. Consciously or not, these spirits are said to attract our attention by presenting our senses with distinguishing features reminiscent of their pre-humus selves, visibly appearing to us as they did in life, speaking to us in their old earthly voices, or manifesting as aromas evocative of perfumes they once wore, or cigars they once smoked, before the final guttering of what the bard called their brief candle. It is more difficult to rationalize ghost stories in which the subject is a vehicle, crewed or occupied by several souls, such as a phantom ship, a ghostly automobile, or a spectral carriage. With the exception of Stephen King and a few overzealous auto mechanics, most of us Westerners scoff at the idea of a lifeless machine like a car or an airplane possessing a soul capable of living on after the final sputterings of its engine have consigned its metal frame to the scrapyard. Nevertheless, sightings of ghostly ships crewed by ghostly sailors, phantom carriages pulled by phantom horses, and other vehicular apparitions are staples of regional folklore. This disturbing reality begets uncomfortable questions. Is it possible that old ships really do have souls, as some schools of maritime superstition have long contended? Could the spirits of railwaymen who lost their lives in a train wreck, lest their tragic ends be forgotten, collectively project a visual portrait of their last moments on Earth onto our mortal plane? In this piece, we'll take a look at one of Canada's most interesting types of vehicular apparitions, the phenomenon of the ghost train. Readers of this author's work may already be familiar with the phantom train of Medicine Hat, Alberta, a strange story, first written down by columnist Ken Little of the Lethbridge Herald in the spring of 1966. and immortalized in Albertan Senator F.W. Gershaw's 1967 book, Samus, the Medicine Hat. Andrew Staceco began little in his original article, who retired in 1955 after 48 years in Canadian Pacific train service, pulled his treasured engineer's watch from his shirt pocket, where he has carried it since vests went out of style. It was time for us to catch the Phantom train. You can believe or disbelieve the story Mr. Staceco told, but he produced documented evidence that something mighty strange happened on 2 occasions amid cutbanks on the line between Medicine Hat and Dunmore in the summer of 1908. Little went on to explain how, in the early 1900s, an engineer named Bob Toohey and a stoker named Gus Day worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway out of the city of Medicine Hat, Alberta, in the southeastern corner of the province. One night in May 1908, these 2 associates were tasked with bringing a train from Medicine Hat to the easterly town of Dunmore, coupling with a passenger train called the Spokane Flyer, and continuing west beyond Lethbridge and into the Crow's Nest Pass. At a point about 2 miles outside of town at that time, where the Canadian Pacific Railway climbs out of the South Saskatchewan River Valley and onto the open prairie, the Canadian Pacific Railway wraps around a cutbank fronting a stream called Ross Creek. This cutbank obstructs the view of the tracks on both sides, preventing both eastbound and westbound trainmen from seeing what lies around the corner. On that fateful night, while they were making their way around the cutbank, Bob Toohey and Gus Day heard a sound that made their blood run cold. The warning whistle of an oncoming train, fast approaching from the east. Moments later, a train's headlights appeared around the cutbank, heralding an imminent head-on collision. Before Day had time to leap from the gangplank, or Toohey the opportunity to crank the brake lever, the approaching locomotive glided laterally off the tracks and sped past, floating on the air. Day stood at the cab doorway, and Toohey's hand remained suspended for the brake valve, Little wrote, as a string of phantom coaches sped past. The coach windows were lighted, and crew members waved a greeting from places where crew members would be expected to be found waving greetings as trains passed. And then the Phantom disappeared. Toohey and Day, each fearful of what the other might have thought had they expressed feelings, said nothing. They continued to Dunmore, coupled to the Spokane Flyer, and finished the night without further incidents. 2 weeks after the strange event, Toohey and Day encountered each other on the streets of Medicine Hat. Both men had spent the interim consumed by thoughts of their bizarre experience, and found the courage to ask what the other had seen that night. To their relief, Toohey and Day found that their recollections of the event were identical. Toohey proceeded to explain that the apparition had spooked him so thoroughly that he had gone to see a fortune teller, who predicted that he would die within the month. In an effort to forestall his upcoming appointment with his maker, he decided to take a few days off work. Day, on the other hand, could not afford that luxury, and was compelled to remain on the job. A few nights after his conversation with Toohey, Day found himself working on the same engine, this time alongside an engineer named J. Nicholson. At exactly the same spot, Little wrote, the Phantom train again appeared, headed toward them with whistle blowing and headlight burning. And again it simply evaporated into the darkness, as its crew members again waved greetings from their positions on its engine and cars. On the morning of June 8, 1908, Gus Day was assigned to yard service, and a stoker named Harry Thompson took his place in the engine room. Thompson's crew, led by engineer J. Nicholson, was to take their train from Medicine Hat to Dunmore, couple with the Spokane Flyer, and travel east to the town of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. They left Medicine Hat and headed into the hills, Little wrote. About 100 yards from the spot where the Phantom train had been seen on 2 different nights and by 2 different crews, another train appeared around a curve, headed straight for them. This time it was daylight, and it was for real. It was number 514, the passenger train coming in from Lethbridge, and the man at the throttle was Bob Toohey, who had overcome his fears and returned to work. A front-page article in the next day's issue of the Medicine Hat News explained what happened next. The collision took place on the elevated piece of track just in front of the Pruitt Brickyard property. One of the workmen was just about to cross the track from the west side and was in such a position that he could see both trains, which each was blocked from view of the other by the high cut bank, around which the track makes an abrupt curve of this point. He waved frantically to Engineer Toohey, and the latter apparently realized the danger as he sprang back and reversed his engine. Just as he appeared at the cab door again, the two engines met, and a dense pall of steam and smoke settled over the wreck for some minutes. When it cleared away, the sight presented was one which will never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. Engine number 702, Spokane Flyer, was forced back off its front truck, and the whole front of the boiler head was torn off. The express car on the Crow train had been partially telescoped through the mail and baggage car and a tourist car. All three cars rolled into the ditch with the locomotive. Engineer Nicholson was quite dead when drawn from the wreck, as was Howard Gray, fireman of the Crow engine. Baggage man Archambault was instantly killed when his car telescoped. The two passengers which were also killed were Messrs. Jas Shaw and Duncan McEachran of Bow Island. 3 more men were seriously injured in the crash and were taken to the Medicine Hat Hospital in precarious condition. One of these was Bob Toohey, whose leg was broken and whose body had been battered. True to the fortune teller's predictions, the engineer soon succumbed to his injuries. In retrospect, Medicine Hat's phantom train, if Gus Day's story can be believed, appears to have been some sort of omen portending the crash of June 8th, a sort of locomotive doppelganger. This same sentiment appears in another prairie ghost story from the American state of Texas, which appeared in the October 1962 issue of the magazine Fate. The witness, Mr. Thomas Phillips, of Pasadena, Texas, claimed to have left the city of Belleville, Texas, on the evening of January 10, 1960, bound for the southerly city of Sealy. Phillips was on a multi-day business trip, and as it was too late for him to do any work in Sealy, he decided to take it easy and drive slowly. The Texas State Highway 36 was almost deserted at that time of night. At one point, while driving down a slight grade, Phillips spotted the lights of 2 oncoming cars far in the distance. As he gazed at the headlights, something in the ditch about 300 feet before him caught his attention. There seemed to be a cloud of fog moving slowly toward the road, he wrote. As I approached, I saw an old-style locomotive emerging from the very midst of the cloud and moving into the road in front of me. Being very close, I applied my brakes. As I watched the engine move across in front of me, I realized there was not a light of any kind on it, nor were there any crossing lights, signs, or signals. I became very angry, and from the bottom of my heart, condemned anyone who would be so stupid as to run a locomotive across a state highway without any warning. Then I noticed that even though my car had excellent lights, they were failing to light up the engine. I could see very clearly the road between the front of my car and the engine, but when they should have shone upon the engine, they just didn't. The engine seemed to be lighted from a source entirely apart from the lights of my car, but as it moved across the road, it came between me and the cars in the distance, and I could not see their lights anymore. The engine slowly passed and was followed by freight cars. As I sat there watching them go by, I could see the light from the horizon between them, but I still could not see the lights from the automobiles in the distance. As freight car after freight car passed, I kept waiting for the caboose, but it never came. The last was just another boxcar. Then suddenly, the lights of the automobiles reappeared in the distance, and my great surprise came when I realized that there was no sign of a railroad bed, not even a break in the pavement where one had ever been. Shaken and eager to share his unnerving experience, Phillips pulled into the nearest establishment, a late-night roadside restaurant. Inside, he struck up a conversation with the restaurant owner and told him about the phantom train. The businessman affirmed that there weren't any railroads in the area, let alone any that crossed the highway. When Phillips asked his opinion on the matter, the restaurant owner, clearly reluctant to discuss the subject, muttered, "It's a warning," without offering any further explanation. While the spectral subjects of the previous 2 stories were supposed to be premonitions of disaster, another ghost train spotted in December 1885 appeared in the wake of a tragedy, almost as if to lament the event, or as if to carry the soul of the boy who lost his life therein to a brighter place. This story appears in the 1966 book Legends of Prince Edward Island, written by folklorist Frank Harold MacArthur. As the book's title would suggest, the tale is set on Prince Edward Island, or PEI, Canada's smallest province, located in the Gulf of St. Lawrence along the borders of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. About 12 miles east of the PEI city of Summerside, on the unofficial border separating the more populous eastern half of the province from the more wild country, which islanders affectionately refer to as Up West, lies the quaint Acadian village of Wellington, situated at the head of the Grand River. It is in this rural community that our tale is set. Going back to December of 1885, MacArthur began, we find the island sleeping under a blanket of snow. The day of December 6th dawned bright, and the air was heavy with hoarfrost. At a place called the Mill House, a large frame dwelling, great preparations were going forward for a wedding supper that night. The bride-to-be was the miller's daughter, beautiful Janet Crosby. The groom, one of Charlottetown's gay young blades, by the name of Hilbert Coates. While the newlyweds' 60-something guests made their way toward the wedding reception, a group of local boys were trying out primitive pioneer ice skates called woodstocks on a pond within sight of the mill house. Vying for a prize put forward by the local blacksmith, who invented the skates, the boys partook in a speed skating competition across the pond. At the height of the contest, one of the skaters broke through thin ice and began to drown. The boy's elder brother, named John, dove after the flailing child, but was unable to rescue him from the frigid water. A local woman named Mrs. Davis, who had been walking by the pond at the time of the accident, managed to help John from the icy hole. Tragically, by the time John's brother was pulled from the water, he was already dead. The young boy's body was subsequently carried into the mill house, transforming the reception hall into a funeral home. Come midnight, Arthur wrote, a train was heard in the distance. All wondered at this, as the regular train had passed some hours before. Suddenly, the whistle shattered the stillness of that December night, followed by the ringing of the train's bell, as the iron horse rounded a curve in the railroad, not half a mile away. Wedding guests and mourners alike watched the mysterious locomotive fly over the railway bridge near the mill house and disappear around another bend. Some witnesses claimed to have seen the silhouette of a solitary passenger walking down the aisle of a coach car. Others reported seeing a lady sitting alone in one of the coaches, clutching a dog which barked as the train flashed past. All recalled the eerie light that poured from the train's headlamp. Among the wedding guests, MacArthur wrote, was a section man, James Ferguson, of Summerside. He and a couple of pals arrived by trolley car, as far as Wellington section, so on hearing the train, they rushed to the station to retrieve the trolley before the train struck it. Soon the young fellows returned to say that they'd removed the trolley, stepped aside to let the train go by, but to their amazement, it just melted from view before their eyes. On enquiries at Summerside, it was learned that no train was dispatched that night. Not all phantom trains are messengers or harbingers of disaster. An excerpt of a letter written from a son to his father, which appeared in newspapers across Canada, the United States, and England throughout the summer of 1898, described one locomotive apparition, which the letter writer at least attributed to some mysterious but natural phenomenon. The anonymous author began his story at a desolate train station at a place called Shawnewan, now a community called Domain, Manitoba, located about 20 miles south of Winnipeg. While waiting for his train to arrive, the writer watched the weather quickly degenerate into a bone-chilling winter storm, complete with howling wind, swirling mist, and icy sheets of wind-blown snow. Shivering next to a telegraph pole, which he used as a windbreak, the writer was delighted when his ride suddenly emerged from the snowy haze. He enthusiastically grabbed his bag and waved his handkerchief in the air, only to watch the approaching train stop about 50 yards from the station. Not wishing to spend one more moment than necessary exposed to the harsh Manitoban elements, the man ran towards the locomotive when it mysteriously and suddenly disappeared. The rider stopped dead in his tracks, unable to reconcile his mind to what his senses had perceived. For several minutes, he stood beside the tracks in stunned amazement when the train broke through the wintry gloom a second time. This time, the locomotive glided off the track and ran across the prairie before melting back into the haze from which it had emerged. It gave me quite an eerie feeling, the sun wrote, and I began to think that the cold had gotten into my head, and I cast superstitious glances around me to see if there were any more trains frolicking about in the snow. And suddenly I bethought me of what I had heard about the mirage. The writer went on to hypothesize that both of his phantom train sightings were contemporaneous visions of the actual train, which arrived a few minutes later, projected by some curious action of the wind and the cold. Next week, we'll take a look at inexplicable phantom lights seen over railways across the Great White North, another of Canada's many railway mysteries.
Phantom locomotives are not the only mysterious apparitions reported on Canadian Railroad. Next, we'll take a look at inexplicable phantom lights over train tracks across the Great White North, another of Canada's many railway mysteries.
If you drive half an hour south of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, you'll come to the tiny village of St. Louis, an old Métis community hugging the southern shore of the South Saskatchewan River. This sleepy hamlet in the heart of central Saskatchewan boasts not only the distinction of being the hometown of 2 NHL players, but also the honor of being the setting of one of Saskatchewan's best-known ghost stories. For nearly 100 years, thrill-seekers across the land of the living skies have flocked to a long-abandoned railroad crossing about 8 kilometers north of town, parked their vehicles beneath the stars, and waited to catch a glimpse of the fabled St. Louis light. Hundreds of Canadians claim to have seen this apparition, which is said to appear almost without fail every night. Witnesses of this mysterious phenomenon invariably describe seeing one of 2 different lights. The first is a large, bright luminescence resembling the headlight of an oncoming train. This light is often said to glide along the route of the old railway track, increasing in brightness as it approaches the witness, before vanishing as suddenly as it appeared. The second light is a smaller orb with a soft red or orange glow, which either hovers in the air or moves erratically over the old track. Both of these lights are very frequently seen together, the red light often lingering below the white, or dancing around its perimeter. The old railway bed over which these lights appear was once a line of the Canadian National Railway. The tracks were abandoned in 1983, their ties and rails pulled up in 1988. Today, the husk of the old iron thoroughfare runs through private farmland, appearing as a grassy trail through prairie scrub. Legend has it that, one cold winter night in the 1920s, when the railroad was in full operation, a brakeman or engineer was obliged to leave the relative safety of his locomotive, perhaps to remove some obstruction from the tracks. Through some terrible accident, he was struck by his own train and decapitated. Ever since, the St. Louis light has appeared over the tracks on which he met his demise. Some say that the bright light so often seen over the old railroad is the headlamp of the engine that killed the unfortunate trainman, and the reddish globe which often accompanies it, a lantern carried by the ghostly victim himself, who returns every night to the site of the accident to search for his missing head. In his article, The St. Louis Ghost Train, published in the Virtual Saskatchewan online magazine, Saskatchewan-based freelance writer Dave Yanko detailed several alleged sightings of the St. Louis light, including that of St. Louis' one-time mayor, the late Émile Lucier. One night many years ago, Lucier and his brother-in-law decided to walk along the old tracks, something that, to the best of their knowledge, nobody had yet tried. After walking for about a mile without seeing anything, a solid beam of bright light appeared directly behind them, its edge kissing their heels, its body casting their shadows onto the abandoned track before them. The 2 men whirled around in unison, but before they could lay eyes on it, the mystery light disappeared. Lucier and his brother-in-law returned to St. Louis and informed friends and relatives of their astonishing experience. Intrigued, a handful of adventurers decided to accompany the two men back to the tracks to see if they too might encounter the light. This time, Lucier contented himself with remaining at the crossroads and watching the boys as they walked down the old trail. Before they were out of sight, a bright globe of light suddenly appeared over the trackbed and illuminated the pedestrians for a few moments before vanishing. Lucier called out to the boys and was astonished to learn that none of them had seen a thing. Lucier's son, Edward, then a teenager, was a member of the party that ventured out onto the tracks that night. He described his experience to writer Taryn Reimer, who published his account in the October 31, 2014 issue of the Western Producer. "The light came behind us," he said, "and lit us up, and the silhouettes in the tracks, and they kind of recognized us. Dad come running, because he thought we'd be scared, and we hadn't even noticed. We didn't see the light ourselves, so that was kind of an eerie thing." Throughout the school season of 2001-02, two young ladies named Shannon Dunn and Alicia Lederhaus, who attended grade 12 at the Churchill High School in La Ronge, Saskatchewan, decided to make the St. Louis Ghost Light the subject of their science fair project. They were not the first Saskatchewan students to investigate this spook light in the name of science. Back in 1999, 10th grade students Dustin Armstrong and Ben McIver of Prince Albert's Carleton Comprehensive High School videotaped the ghost light as part of their own science project and declared it a paranormal phenomenon when they found that their camera had failed to capture the light they had seen with their eyes. Shannon Dunn and Alicia Lederhaus had also seen the ghost light of St. Louis on an erstwhile road trip they made to the area with several friends, an event which had thoroughly spooked some of their fellow students. Dunn, a firm believer in the paranormal, suspected that the ghostly luminescence was truly some sort of preternatural phenomenon. Lederhaus, on the other hand, was a skeptic at heart and believed that the phantom light was probably produced by the headlights and taillights of vehicles traveling along some nearby road. As she put it in an interview with journalist Jill Streliev of Saskatchewan's Leader Post, "I thought right off the bat that it was car headlights, especially because a lot of stories say that you can see red lights sometimes. I thought that would be taillights." Lederhaus's hypothesis echoes a long-held objection to the ghost explanation, espoused by skeptics across Saskatchewan. This idea was succinctly articulated by the late Don McPhedran, then an 88-year-old resident of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, in journalist Darren Bernhardt's excellent article on the St. Louis Light in the October 27, 2001 issue of Saskatoon's Star Phoenix. "They go out of sight wherever there's a little dip," McPhedran told Bernhardt, "and then they reappear again, and then turn and go slightly northeast. Then you see the taillights." Taking this theory as their hypothesis, Shannon Dunn and Alicia Lederhaus set out to solve the St. Louis mystery once and for all. With help from Lederhaus's father, who worked as a surveyor for a mineral exploration company, the girls ordered a magnified map of the area surrounding the old railroad, plotted the point at which they had seen the ghost light on their previous trip, as well as the location from which the light appeared to originate, and drew a straight line through the dots. That accomplished, they identified the roads which the line intersected or ran close to, and determined a handful of locations along those roads at which they resolved to test their hypothesis. Their preparations complete, Dunn, Lederhaus, and the latter's father made the 3-hour drive south to St. Louis. When night fell, the girls ensconced themselves in the area from which the ghost light is typically observed, while Lederhaus's father drove his car to the points on nearby roads which the girls had plotted. At each point, Mr. Lederhaus oriented his vehicle in the direction of the observation point and flashed his high beams on and off, keeping the girls abreast of his activities via cell phone. Although the girls did observe the phantom light on several occasions that night, its appearance seemed to have no correlation with Mr. Lederhaus's operations. Left with little alternative, the girls decided to have Mr. Lederhaus drive down Saskatchewan Highway 2, a thoroughfare which lay 8.5 kilometers or 5.3 miles from the observation area at its closest point, which the girls had not initially considered a potential location for the source of the ghost light on account of its distance from the old railroad tracks. The other roads in which they had conducted their tests, they noted, were lower in elevation than the observation point, while a hilltop section of Highway 2 lay at approximate elevation. They hoped that this last-ditch effort might yield interesting results, and they were not disappointed. We got Dad to stay out there for about half an hour, just flashing his lights off and on when we tell him to, Lederhouse told Streliev. He even turned around, but we saw his taillights. We could actually see his taillights from 8.5 kilometers away. Satisfied that they had successfully replicated the St. Louis ghost light, the young scientists concluded their fieldwork and returned home. Although Dunn and Lederhouse were confident that they had determined the true source of the mystery light, they remained baffled as to how a high beam light from the hill on Highway 2 could possibly reach the observation point. They consulted their physics teacher, who suggested a phenomenon called diffraction as a possible explanation. Diffraction being the distortion which light waves undergo upon encountering opaque obstacles. As an article in the Virtual Saskatchewan online magazine explains, light passing through a small opening, perhaps some distant trees on either side of the old trackbed, can diffuse and expand in size. In other words, headlights normally too tiny to be noticed could become apparent through diffraction. While the car light explanation has satisfied many, including the judges of the regional science fair in which Dunn and Lederhouse participated, who awarded the girls third place for their project, many witnesses of St. Louis' phantom light remain unconvinced. One witness named Rita Furland, for example, who saw the phantom light move along the tracks in broad daylight while picking raspberries with her mother, is certain that no vehicle light, diffracted or not, could possibly account for her bizarre daytime experience. Others claim that the car light explanation is untenable, since, according to local folklore, the St. Louis light has been seen regularly since the 1920s, in an age before the automobile eclipsed the horse as the vehicle of choice on the Saskatchewan prairies. Others still argue that the light's typical appearance, behavior, and duration negate the possibility that it might be derived from the lights of passing vehicles. As Canadian author Shannon Sin put it, in his video of the St. Louis ghost light, which he captured on film on New Year's Eve 2014, you tell me if you think that's a headlight right there. If you'd like to watch Shannon's footage, please check out the link in the top right-hand corner of this video. Perhaps the strongest evidence that the St. Louis light may be more than an optical illusion is the story of Chris McLeod, a native of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, whose unnerving tale appears in both Darren Bernhardt's aforementioned article and Joanne Christensen's 1995 book, Ghost Stories of Saskatchewan. When he was 17 years old, McLeod and his friend, Justin Thorsteinson, made regular trips to St. Louis in a Chevrolet Cavalier to see the ghost light. Their final and most dramatic visit took place one cold winter night in 1987. One of the unwritten rules of the St. Louis light is that you never park your car on the tracks, McLeod told Christensen. Being the immortal adolescent that I was, I sometimes did just that. McLeod found that this breach of etiquette was often succeeded by minor annoyances, such as the spontaneous animation of his windshield wipers, the flickering of his headlights, or problems with the ignition. On this particular occasion, however, his brashness brought him more than he bargained for. McLeod and Thorsteinson had only been idling for 2 minutes when the familiar ray of light appeared over the old tracks. For about 30 seconds, the eerie luminescence glided along ghostly rails, increasing in brilliance as it came towards them. All of a sudden, smoke began to billow from the Cavalier's hood. Tearing their eyes away from the haunting spectacle, the boys turned off the engine and opened the hood to find the alternator engulfed in flames. "We had no way of extinguishing an electrical fire," McLeod wrote, "so we decided to blow it out on the highway." The teenagers raced back to Prince Albert in a panic, but encountered no further issues on the drive. They subsequently had the Cavalier inspected by a mechanic, who declared that the alternator appeared to be in perfect condition, and who could provide no explanation for its mysterious ignition. In 2014, Canada Post represented the ghost light of St. Louis in a collection of permanent stamps honoring 10 classic Canadian ghost stories. The Post added 5 more stamps to its Haunted Canada collection in 2015, one of which commemorated another phantom light whose alleged appearance and supposed backstory eerily echoes that of its St. Louis counterpart. In the city of Vancouver, British Columbia, at the northern end of the historic Gastown district, at the edge of Vancouver Harbour, lies an old Canadian Pacific Railway yard. Local legend has it that on dark and rainy nights, a soft glow, evoking the light of an old lantern, can sometimes be seen flickering in the yard, moving slowly across the tracks, before suddenly guttering out. Only a handful of unfortunate TransLink employees, who operate the SkyTrain lines out of the adjacent waterfront station, are said to have caught a glimpse of the ghastly spectre to which this ghostly lantern is attached. The figure of a brakeman wearing 1920s railway overalls, who appears to be searching for his missing head. The oldest published material on this spooky urban legend which this author was able to unearth, on which many subsequent retellings appear to be based, is Ted Ferguson's 1985 book, Sentimental Journey, an oral history of train travel in Canada. Ferguson's book is a collection of anonymous anecdotes on Canadian rail travel, which the author assembled throughout 1984, most of them excerpts of spontaneous interviews with railway veterans he met during a cross-Canada trip. According to one of Ferguson's unnamed sources, the Phantom Light of Vancouver's oldest train yard has its roots in an event which took place one dark and rainy night in 1928. While pulling into the train yard, a brakeman named Hub Clark slipped on the rain-slick floor of a boxcar and fell from a freight train, lantern in hand. He tumbled awkwardly and hit his head on one of the rails, knocking himself unconscious. Before Clark knew what hit him, an incoming passenger train, whose conductor's vision was impeded by the rain and the darkness, slammed into his prostrate form, rending his head from his body. Ever since, Clark's headless ghost is said to return to the train yard on dark and rainy nights, and, lantern in hand, walk the tracks in search of his lost head. Another of Ferguson's nameless informants told him about a ghost light which Canadian National Railway men routinely spotted at night on a stretch of tracks in central Alberta. "I was clerking for the CN in Edmonton," he said, "before I transferred to the coast. In the 1930s, we'd get these reports of mysterious lights, no kidding. Engineers barreling at night, and suddenly there's a white glow on the rails ahead. The brakes go on, the train halts, and the lights disappeared. In God's back acre, nothing for 100 miles around, with the exception of coyotes and gophers, and they sure as hell don't light up in the dark. The engineers couldn't make heads nor tails of it." The anonymous trainman went on to scoff at the idea that ghosts were behind the mystery lights, suggesting instead that flying saucers were responsible. Vehicular malfunctions and headless trainmen notwithstanding, it is tempting to propose a connection between the above-mentioned ghost lights and a phenomenon called the Will-o'-the-Wisp. Variously referred to as Jacks of the Lantern and Ignes Fatui, or Fool Fires, Wills of the Wisp are mysterious flickering lights resembling lanterns or candle flames, which are said to appear in certain wilderness areas at night, often to lone travelers. Those who attempt to follow these lights often find themselves led off the beaten path into rugged and dangerous country, only to watch the object of their pursuit suddenly vanish, leaving them lost and alone in the darkness. Folkloric traditions all over the world propose different explanations for this strange optical phenomenon. Celtic legend, for example, ascribed the lights to the lanterns of mischievous fairies, who delight in disorienting human travelers. Anglo-Saxon tradition, from which derive the names Will-o'-the-Wisp and Jack-o'-the-Lantern, contends that the lights are the lanterns carried by lost souls, perhaps as divine punishment for misdeeds committed in life. To the Tlingit of the Alaskan Panhandle, mysterious lights in the wilderness are the campfires of the Kushtaka, or Land Otter Man, a semi-preternatural entity which preys on lost travelers. Science has also proposed a number of theories to account for Wills-o'-the-Wisp. One of the most popular scientific explanations, which hinges upon the observation that mysterious flickering lights are often seen over swamps and bogs, contends that these nocturnal candles are produced by the natural combustion of certain flammable gases which regularly leak from wetlands, which ignite when exposed to oxygen. This explanation, of course, cannot account for the many mystery lights reported in deserts and other settings in which such gases are not present in requisite concentrations. Other scientists have proposed that ball lightning might be the culprit. Ball lightning being a volatile airborne globe of light which appears very infrequently during thunderstorms, supposed to be an extremely uncommon and poorly understood form of lightning. This explanation, considering the alleged rarity of ball lightning, cannot account for will-o'-the-wisp which are said to appear in the same general area on a regular basis. A third explanation holds that will-o'-the-wisp are bioluminescent clouds, produced by the activity of some sort of organism, fireflies and foxfire fungi being the most frequently indicted suspects. Whatever its nature, some of those who have written on the subject have equated the will-o'-the-wisp with mysterious lights which appear over railroad tracks, of which the St. Louis Light and the ghost of Hub Clark are but two of several. One such researcher was Fortean writer Curtis Fuller, whose article A Problem for Physicists appeared in the February 1953 issue of the magazine Fate. After arguing that the various scientific explanations for the will-o'-the-wisp phenomenon are far from satisfactory, Fuller described a certain mysterious light which once appeared regularly over a stretch of the Grand Trunk Railway which ran along the northern shore of Ontario's Lake Simcoe. His primary source was an elderly lady named Mrs. J.B. Running, who lived on Toronto's Harshaw Avenue at the time of writing. 50 years earlier, when she had lived in the Brechin district along Lake Simcoe's northern shore, Mrs. Running claimed that the mystery light appeared so frequently that she and her neighbors became used to it and accepted it as an inexplicable but regular fixture of the area. Brechin's 1950s residents appear to have maintained a less cordial relationship with their neighborhood will-o'-the-wisp than their turn-of-the-century predecessors, as Fuller's article and a contemporaneous newspaper piece bear out. One of the light's favorite pranks, Fuller wrote, was to appear on the Grand Trunk railway tracks and stop trains. When the crew climbed down to find out the trouble, the light, which gave a reddish glow much like a lantern, disappeared completely into the swamp. The September 3, 1952 issue of Sault Ste. Marie's newspaper, the Sault Star, described a similar incident. Provincial police and residents of the northeast end of Lake Simcoe played tag last night and early today with a red light. The light, first reported late in the evening, was said to have appeared at many points around the lake. Police checked each report, but the cause of the light has not been determined. Unlike the St. Louis Light, this particular mystery light did not confine its capers to the railroad track. At the end of his article, Fuller wrote, Mrs. Running recalled a game warden named Henry Thompson, who chased the light several times as it went ahead of him down a trail to his cabin beside the lake. He used to laugh about it, until one morning he came into the Brechin Hotel, white-faced and shaken. Seems he had waked up during the night to hear a loud buzzing outside his cabin window. His dog was running around looking for a place to hide, and his cat was climbing the wall. Right outside the window was a ball of fire, as big as a football. Will-o'-the-wisp, of course, whatever that is.
As the tale of Hub Clark so chillingly illustrates, the life of a railwayman is a dangerous one, fraught with the ever-present risk of serious accident. Some trainmen who narrowly avoided such accidents have attributed their luck to some mysterious force which guided them to safety. Perhaps a guardian angel, or some strange human quality yet to be acknowledged by science. In our third and final segment, we will explore stories of psychic warnings on the Canadian Pacific Railway.
It could be argued that the modern nation of Canada, or at least its western half, owes its very existence to the Canadian Pacific Railway, or CPR, that great transcontinental highway which has connected the Canadian Maritimes with the Pacific Ocean since 1885. It was on the condition that the railroad be built that the province of British Columbia agreed to join the Easterly Dominion back in 1871. It was, in part, for the purpose of ensuring its safe construction that the Northwest Mounted Police, Canada's first Mounties, were formed up and sent west onto the prairies in 1874, where they brought British law and order to what are now the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. As might be expected of this most historic and foundational piece of Canadian infrastructure, the CPR is the axle around which revolve some of the country's best known and most intriguing mysteries. One of Canada's great classic Sasquatch stories, the tale of Jacko, the controversial wild man from Yale, is set during the turbulent days of the railroad's construction through British Columbia, when Chinese navvies were laying ties across the interior plateau, and work camps lined the sandbars of the Fraser Canyon. The chilling story of the Phantom Train of Medicine Hat, Alberta, a phantasmal omen which portended a deadly locomotive collision in 1908, has appeared in many a Canadian ghost story anthology, from John Robert Colombo's classic works to Barbara Smith's popular paranormal series. The legendary Headless Brakeman of Vancouver, BC, has featured in a spooky Canada Post stamp collection, and nearly all of Canada's grand railway hotels, from the Chateau Frontenac to the Banff Springs Hotel, have their own well-known hauntings, most of which the establishments officially deny. In this piece, we will explore some of the lesser-known tales of the unexplained, told by conductors, engineers, and firemen who worked that Great Iron Road throughout the previous 2 centuries. Enjoy. 3 remarkable tales of CPR mystery appeared in the July 1962 issue of the magazine Fate, in an article written by Julie C. Crawford. Julie learned these stories from her father, Matthew Fulton Crawford, a senior locomotive engineer who worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway. According to Julie, Matthew Crawford, prior to his death in 1954 at the age of 92, was the last living person to have been present at the driving of the CPR's famous Last Spike on November 7, 1885, at Craigalackie, BC. The men who pioneered the Canadian Pacific Railway through British Columbia, Julie began, had many hair-breadth escapes from sudden death, and most of them attributed their survival to warnings of one kind or another they had received. Wherever a group of railwaymen gathered, sooner or later, the conversation turned to this subject, and around some of these true warnings have grown up legends that persist to this day. Matthew Crawford received his first psychic warning while he was a young man, during a routine trip from the newly incorporated city of Kamloops to the community of North Bend in the Fraser Canyon. It was in the spring of 1895, Julie wrote, not far from the spot where the Thompson River empties into the mighty Fraser. The track there runs through a twisting series of curves that are still, at times, subject to mud and rock slides that come hurtling down the hillsides after a rain or snowfall, blocking the track for years, and sometimes carrying it away altogether. Matthew's experience took place on a dark and rainy night, when the locomotive headlight only dimly pierced the heavy precipitation that was quickly transforming the Thompson and Fraser canyons into a muddy morass. With the darkness having thrown its heavy shroud over the spectacular scenery which that stretch of railroad afforded trainmen in the daytime, Matthew's mind began to wander. Soon, he found himself thinking about his young wife, who had died suddenly and unexpectedly in childbirth. In the darkness, Julie wrote, she seemed very near to him. As he reminisced, Matthew was suddenly struck by the uneasy feeling that the pouring rain which so hampered his visibility would trigger a rock slide that night, somewhere in the Thompson or Fraser canyons. He said as much to the inexperienced fireman who sat in the opposite seat, sipping tea. The younger man tried to allay his fear, assuring him that the watchman on duty that night, a competent railroad veteran called Old Honey, would be extra vigilant in such nasty weather. Suddenly, out of the blue, Matthew heard a voice in his ear say, "Stop. Don't go any further." "What did you say?" he asked the fireman. "What did you see ahead?" "I didn't see anything or say anything," his colleague replied, "because I wasn't looking out of the window. What's the matter with you?" "But you said to stop," Matthew retorted. "I said no such thing. Why would I? Don't go getting pipe dreams, Matt." No sooner had the fireman turned his back than Matthew heard the clear command, "Stop. Stop right now." Matthew stared at the fireman, who was preparing to refuel the firebox, apparently unaware of the startling injunctions that were causing his partner so much consternation. He then leaned out the window, but could only see a few feet ahead on account of the rain and the darkness. As he hesitated, the same strange voice barked, "Stop." This time, Matthew obeyed and cranked the brake lever, "Well, what do you think you're doing?" the fireman asked. "They aren't going to like this back on the tail." "I'm stopping the train," Matthew replied quietly, "and I don't care whether they like it or not. Someone, or something, told me to stop, and I'm doing just that, till I find out what's ahead." As Matthew, torch in hand, made to exit the train, he was accosted on the gangway by the conductor and the brakeman, who seemed intent on giving him a thorough dressing down. When he explained the reason for his action, the conductor nodded soberly and volunteered to accompany him on foot to see if anything unusual lay up ahead on the tracks. When the young fireman scoffed at this display of superstition, the conductor gave him a sharp look and snapped, "You're still pretty green about these things, ain't you? After a while you'll learn, maybe. If you don't, you'll be no use on a railroad." With that, Matthew and the conductor stepped into the mud. After trudging about 100 yards up the tracks, the two men stopped and motioned for the firemen and brakemen, who watched derisively from the train, to join them. "My God," the fireman whispered as he approached the two veterans. "Look at that." "Yes, you should thank God," Matthew replied. "For certainly, but for that warning, we'd be in the Fraser now." Just up ahead, a huge rock slide had swept the track and the embankment on which it rested 100 feet below into the Fraser River. "Let this be a warning to you, my lad," the conductor told the brakeman sternly. "When a seasoned railroader like Matt says he has a hunch to stop, he has a hunch. See you never forget what you've learned tonight, if you want to be a railroader." Matthew Crawford's next strange experience took place about a year later, in the spring of 1896, on a night much like the aforementioned. This time, his train was eastbound, destined for Kamloops. His fireman on this trip was his brother-in-law, John Jack Ladner. Although naturally a cheerful and carefree soul, Jack had an uneasy feeling about this particular journey, confidentially remarking several times to his brother-in-law that he would be glad to get home in one piece that night. Matthew and Jack were drinking tea in the cab while the train skirted the shores of Kamloops Lake, a winding stretch of track typified by sharp curves and short tunnels. When they reached a bend in the road, a short distance from the Cherry Creek Tunnel, roughly halfway down the lake, the cab gong began to ring. This gong was connected to the caboose by a long cord which ran across the top of the train, and was designed to ring automatically at both ends whenever the train broke apart, which happened with casual frequency in those days of handbrakes, alerting both the conductor and the engineer. Baffled as to how the train could have broken apart at that relatively flat grade, Matthew nonetheless seized the throttle and slowed the engine to a stop. No sooner had the gong stopped ringing than Matthew and Jack were approached by conductor Sam Jones, who wanted to know the reason for their unscheduled pit stop. Jack, his gloomy foreboding apparently forgotten, facetiously asked Jones whether he and the brakeman had been arguing about the upcoming federal election, the candidates being Wilfrid Laurier for the Liberals and Charles Tupper for the Conservatives, and had pulled the cord in their agitation. On the contrary, the conductor and his colleague had been cooking breakfast, doing their best to watch their language in the company of Father Jean-Marie Raphael Lejeune, a French Catholic priest who served as the superior of the St. Louis Mission in Kamloops, whom they had picked up earlier in their journey. Neither of them had pulled the cord, and Jones had seen no sign of a break on his way up to the cab. Suspecting that the cord had been pulled by a hobo hiding somewhere on the train, the crew made a quick search of all the places where train hoppers typically rode, but were unable to find any trace of an unpaying passenger. Having exhausted all rational explanations, the crew proceeded on toward the Cherry Creek Tunnel. But no sooner had the train begun to drift around the long curve, Julie Road, than the gong rang again, loud and insistent. At the same time, Jack, who had his head out of the window, drew it in to shout, "My God, Matt, the mouth of the tunnel is blocked with a slide. Shut her off and jump for your life. Quick, before we hit." In less time than it takes to tell, both men had jumped through the cab windows, since there was no time to seek the usual way out of the stricken engine, as she mounted the huge rock pile and lay there a broken thing, panting out great clouds of steam in the dawn air. Matthew Crawford landed on the sandy slope of the lakeshore, on which he broke his wrist, struck his head, and was knocked unconscious. Jack Ladner, on the other hand, hurled himself onto a pile of rocks, on which he injured his back severely. The rest of the crew was mercifully unhurt, and quickly tended to their injured colleagues. Father Lejeune, also unscathed, volunteered to walk to the Cherry Creek station and inform the operator of the obstacle. If the gong had not rang, and Dad had not stopped the train just before the accident, Julie wrote, both of them would have been killed, for the train would have plowed into the rock pile, going at full speed. Jack managed to get the gong from the repair crew, and for years hung it beneath his window, so that the call boy, summoning him in the middle of the night, needed only to pull the cord to wake him. Julie's third and final story is set in January 1904, when both her father and her Uncle Jack were working out of the city of Revelstoke, British Columbia, on an alpine route which stretched from that city to Laggan, Alberta, the site of present-day Lake Louise. This mountain passage was both beautiful and dangerous, consisting of a series of switchbacks that wound through both the Albertan Rockies and BC's Columbia Ranges. In order to traverse this treacherous trail, locomotives required the assistance of an auxiliary engine, or pusher. Although the pusher job was monotonous, it paid well, and so Jack Ladner, whose preacher father was given to open-handed generosity, opted to work exclusively in the auxiliary engines in order to allow his mother some extra luxuries. Matthew Crawford had spent the evening of January 21st, 1904, with his wife's family, the Ladners, in Revelstoke. Cognizant that he had to return to work early the next morning, he kept his visit short. When the time came for him to say goodnight, Mrs. Ladner gave him a pair of hand-knit warm wristers and asked him to give them to her son Jack if he managed to see him at Laggan or at the station in Field, BC, at the summit of the road. All the way east the next day, Julie wrote, Dad was glad his mother-in-law could not see the mountains as they looked in the intense cold, menacing, implacable. The track was in fair condition, for the big rotary plow had preceded the passenger train, and he was right on time when he pulled into Field Station at the summit at 6 o'clock. Sure enough, Jack Ladner was present at the Field Station at the time of Matthew's arrival, and watched his train crawl into the station. No sooner had the locomotive come to a stop than Jack swung into the cab to give his brother-in-law a hearty hello. After exchanging news, Matthew gave Jack the wrist warmers his mother had knitted for him, and showed him a new pocket watch he had purchased, of which he was very proud. The case isn't much, he said, but it's 21 jeweled, the best works I could afford, and guaranteed to keep perfect time. After chatting for some time, the two men parted ways, Matthew to continue his journey to Laggan, and Jack bound for Revelstoke with a load of heavy freight. Jack, be extra careful going down the hill, Matthew cautioned. It's a bad night, and if you've got a heavy train, you may have some trouble. It's slippery now, and the track's getting worse all the time. Hold her tight. Thanks, Matt, Jack replied. You're always looking out for me, but I've gone down the hill in a lot of blizzards this winter. I'm getting used to it. Besides, if the train starts to run away, there's always the safety switches. Nothing could happen once the train got in them. I'll be all right. But if I don't get there, I'll find a way to let you know. This last remark was a reference to Jack's oft-repeated insistence that, if he ever met a sticky end on the railroad, as he strongly supposed he would do everything in his ghostly power to let Matthew know about it. Matthew's journey to Laggan was uneventful. When his work was complete, he headed to the station boarding house for a hot meal and an evening of banter and camaraderie with his fellow trainmen. In the midst of the after-dinner conversation, Matthew, eager to show off his new pocket watch, drew his timepiece from his pocket and showed it to the men with whom he was chatting, saying casually, It's not much to look at because I didn't splurge on the case, but it keeps perfect. Rather than displaying the correct time, however, the watch was stopped at 7:56. While the trainman jokingly disparaged the jeweler who had sold him the watch, Matthew attempted to move the hands ahead to the correct time. Bizarrely, they refused to budge, glued resolutely to 7:56. Suddenly, Matthew was struck by a hideous hunch. Pushing back his chair, he shrugged into his coat and set out for the station, ignoring the laughs and jeers of his fellow trainmen as he headed into the cold. Halfway to the station, he ran into the operator, who had just searched for him at the bunkhouse. With a heavy heart, the operator informed him that Jack's train had ran off the rails, having broken through 2 safety switches. It broke its descent by slamming head-on into a huge rock. Rescuers on the scene had yet to find any sign of Jack or his firemen. Matthew spent the ensuing week working on the wrecking crew, searching for any sign of his missing brother-in-law on the mountainside. 3 days later, Jack's broken body was discovered beneath the twisted metal of the ruined engine. His own pocket watch had stopped at 7:56, the exact same time as Matthew's, as had the clock on the second safety switch through which the train had broken. Although Jack's pocket watch and the clock on the safety switch ran perfectly well once they were rewound, Matthew's watch never worked again, its hands pointing obstinately to the very minute at which Jack had met his untimely demise. Matthew later brought the watch to 2 different jewelers, who determined that there was nothing wrong with any of its components. They were unable to ascertain why it had stopped in the first place, and why it refused to resume its regular function. Julie explained that one of her uncle's friends implored her father to leave the watch as it was, and never attempt to use it again. And he didn't, she wrote. It still is in the family, its hands fixed at the hour when my uncle left this world so tragically. Naturally, the watch was talked about for a long time whenever 2 railroaders met, and it was not unusual to have perfect strangers come to the house and say, "I work for the CPR out of Calgary, or Moose Jaw, or Brandon. We heard that you have the watch that stopped when your brother-in-law was killed. Can we see it?" And Dad would show it and tell the story again. Coincidence? Maybe. But Dad said that Jack had kept his promise, and had let him know the exact minute he had reached the end of his earthly run.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up and share this video on social media.